In forgotten heights where wind moves across stone older than memory, where cliffs hold the silence of centuries and snow carries stories that no one hears until they listen closely enough, justice does not shout. It whispers. And every act leaves an echo. This is Whispers of Reckoning. Long before Elias Rowe climbed the final ridge to the lookout tower, the mountain had already been watching him. Mountains always watch. People imagine mountains as obstacles. Barriers. Walls of stone that must be conquered. But mountains are not obstacles. They are witnesses. They observe every decision made upon their slopes. Every misstep. Every moment of hesitation. Every moment of arrogance. They do not interfere. They simply hold the memory. And eventually, memory answers. Elias Rowe did not come to the mountain seeking answers. He came to escape them. The Fire Lookout Tower stood above the tree line on a narrow ridge where the forest ended and bare stone began. From the tower's windows Elias could see for miles in every direction. Dark forests filled the valleys below like oceans of green. Jagged peaks rose beyond the horizon. Clouds moved slowly across the sky as though drifting through a much older world. During summer the lookout's job was simple. Watch for smoke. Report any sign of wildfire before it spread through the forests below. But by late autumn the fire season had passed. Snow began dusting the ridges. The forests turned quiet. And Elias remained. Alone. He had not spoken to another human being in 11 months. Not because no one tried. Because he chose not to answer. Rangers called the tower occasionally to check conditions. Supply helicopters passed overhead once a month. Sometimes hikers waved from the distant trails below. Elias acknowledged none of it. Silence suited him. Silence did not ask questions. Silence did not accuse. Silence did not remind him of the moment 2 years earlier when a man had slipped from a ridge and fallen into empty air. Before the accident, Elias Rowe had been one of the most respected climbing guides in the Cascades. He understood rock. Understood weather. Understood how to move people safely across dangerous terrain. Clients trusted him with their lives. That trust had once felt like responsibility. Then it became something heavier. Something closer to burden. The group that day had been small. 3 climbers. All experienced enough to follow instructions. Carefully. The weather forecast predicted stable conditions. Cold but manageable. Wind moderate. No storm warnings. Elias had studied the ridge carefully before leading them upward. The route climbed along a narrow shelf of volcanic rock that curved toward the summit like a staircase carved into the mountainside. Thousands of climbers had crossed that section safely. But mountains never promise consistency. Halfway across the ridge, the wind shifted. Not violently. Just enough to change the pressure against the rock face. Elias noticed it immediately. He paused. Studied the clouds gathering along the far peaks. He considered turning back. But the summit stood less than an hour away. And conditions still looked manageable. So he continued. The decision seemed small at the time. 1 step forward instead of 1 step back. That was all. Minutes later one of the climbers slipped. Not a dramatic fall. Just a sudden loss of footing when loose stone shifted beneath his boot. The rope caught him instantly. Elias felt the tension pull through the harness. Then the rock shelf cracked. The sound echoed sharply against the cliff. Stone fractured beneath the anchor point. The rope snapped sideways against jagged rock. And the man fell. Not far. But far enough. The mountain swallowed the sound almost immediately. Wind moved across the ridge. Snow drifted along the rock face. And Elias Rowe stood frozen with the rope still clutched in his hands. Investigations followed. Reports were written. Weather records reviewed. Climbing equipment inspected. The final conclusion cleared Elias of negligence. The conditions had changed unexpectedly. The rock shelf had been unstable beneath the surface. The accident had been unavoidable. But mountains do not release people so easily. Even when the world forgives you, the memory of a decision remains. Elias resigned from guiding the following week. He packed his equipment, sold most of what he owned, and accepted the fire lookout position high in the Cascades. A place where conversation was unnecessary. A place where no one would ask him to make decisions that might place another life at risk. Isolation felt like justice. If he removed himself from the world, he reasoned, no one else could suffer because of his judgment. He believed punishment required distance. He believed silence was fairness. But mountains do not measure guilt. They measure pressure. And pressure eventually moves. The first months in the lookout tower passed quietly. Elias followed routine with mechanical precision. Check the horizon. Log temperature. Record wind direction. Scan the valleys for smoke. Repeat. Days passed without incident. Weeks passed without conversation. At night the wind moved around the tower with low hollow sounds that echoed through the wooden structure. Sometimes the wind reminded him of voices. But he ignored the thought. Memories have a way of reshaping ordinary sound when given too much attention. Autumn arrived earlier than expected that year. Snow began dusting the highest ridges by mid-October. Cold air sharpened along the exposed rock. The forests below darkened as the first storms rolled across the mountains. Elias welcomed the change. Winter meant fewer hikers. Fewer helicopters. Less chance of encountering another human voice. Silence deepened around the tower. For a while, the quiet felt like relief. Then one afternoon the wind carried something unusual. Elias stood at the lookout window scanning the western horizon when he heard it. A sound beneath the wind. Faint. Uncertain. Almost like a voice. He turned slowly. The tower creaked softly as wind pressed against the walls. Nothing moved outside except drifting snow. Elias returned to the window. The sound came again. Clearer this time. Elias. He stiffened. The voice had spoken his name. Elias stepped outside onto the narrow balcony surrounding the tower. The mountain stretched endlessly beneath the pale sky. Cliffs. Snowfields. Endless ridgelines fading into distance. No one stood anywhere within sight. The wind rose again, moving across the exposed rock like a long breath. Elias listened carefully. Silence returned. He told himself the explanation immediately. Sound travels strangely across mountains. Voices can echo from distant trails. Wind can carry fragments of conversation farther than expected. The phenomenon was well known among climbers. He had explained it to clients many times. Yet something about the voice unsettled him. Because he had not spoken. There had been no conversation for the wind to carry. And the voice had known his name. The voice did not return that day. But the mountain changed. Elias felt it in the air before he saw it in the sky. The temperature dropped faster than the forecast had suggested. The wind no longer moved in long clean lines across the ridge. Instead it shifted in short irregular bursts that struck the tower from one side, then another, as though the weather itself had not yet decided how it wanted to. Cross the mountain. He noted the changes in the logbook with the same disciplined handwriting he used for everything. Wind unstable. Cloud build to northwest. Temperature falling ahead of schedule. He wrote the facts because facts were easier than interpretation. Facts did not ask whether the voice had been real. Facts did not care that he had stood on the balcony listening to empty air with his pulse climbing for reasons he refused to name. Facts did not remind him of another mountain, another ridge, another day when he had felt something shift before it became visible and had still chosen to continue upward. So Elias trusted the logbook. He trusted routine. He trusted the precision of observation, because observation did not require forgiveness. The following morning the sky over the western range had turned the pale metallic gray that often preceded snow squalls. Not a major storm, not yet, but enough weather to make the ridgelines harsher and the descent trails less reliable for anyone careless enough to underestimate mountain conditions. Which, Elias thought, was exactly what people did. They underestimated. They believed mountains existed in the same emotional category as parks or overlooks or recreational challenge. They called danger beautiful and then seemed surprised when beauty failed to make exceptions for them. He spent the early hours scanning the valleys with binoculars, noting the color change in the timber below and the dusting of fresh snow settling across higher shelves of exposed rock. Around midday, a message came through the ranger radio about trail closures likely beginning if the squall line accelerated. Elias acknowledged the transmission with the shortest answer possible and returned to silence. That should have been the whole day. It almost was. In early afternoon the wind rose again, sharper now, pushing fine snow across the ridge in low fast ribbons. Visibility held, but only barely. Elias stepped outside with the binoculars to scan the lower trail system one more time before the weather deteriorated. At first he saw nothing unusual. The marked trail snaked below the tower in a series of pale switchbacks cut across darker stone. Beyond it the mountain fell into steep timbered valleys where no sane hiker should have been wandering that late in the season. The cloud base hung lower than before. Snow moved intermittently through the air. Then something shifted below. A small movement on the slope. Elias raised the binoculars. A person. Halfway between the marked trail and the exposed boulder field east of the ridge. Too low for the tower to reach quickly. Too high for easy rescue if the squall fully closed in. The figure moved badly. Not injured exactly, but uncertain. Stumbling in short bursts. Pausing too often. Turning in ways that suggested disorientation rather than navigation. Elias lowered the binoculars and looked again with his own eyes, as if some lesser hope remained that the lens had invented what it found. The hiker was still there. He stepped inside immediately and grabbed the radio. "Lookout 7 to Ranger Base," he said. "I have visual on one hiker off trail east slope below the tower. Weather closing. Possible disorientation." Static crackled, then a voice answered. "Copy, Lookout 7. Can you maintain visual?" "For now. Rescue team can mobilize from the lower station, but in these conditions they're looking at 2, maybe 3 hours to reach that side." Elias's grip tightened slightly on the radio. Too long. Even before the ranger said it, he knew. The squall was building faster than forecast. Temperature had already fallen. If the hiker had no bivouac gear, no winter shell, or no understanding of how quickly mountain visibility can die, 2 hours might as well have been tomorrow. "Continue observation," the ranger said. "Do not descend unless instructed. We're calling this in." Elias answered automatically. "Copy." But the words sat badly in his mouth. "Do not descend. Follow procedure. Wait." He understood the protocol. The fire lookout was not a rescue outpost. He was one person, above Treeline, on a mountain already becoming hostile. Leaving the tower in deteriorating conditions could create a second victim for the rescue team to find. That was the logic. Logic had cleared him once before. Logic had helped write a report explaining that a dead man's fall on the ridge had not technically been his fault. Logic had not made sleep easier. He lifted the binoculars again. The hiker had moved farther offline. Instead of correcting back toward the marked trail, he was drifting toward a shallow basin where wind-driven snow gathered quickly between broken rocks. It was the kind of place inexperienced climbers misread as shelter and then regretted when the drift deepened and visibility vanished. The radio hissed softly in his hand. He set it down. Outside, the wind struck the tower again. Then he heard it. Not loud. Not ghostly. Simply clear. Elias. He turned sharply. No one stood on the balcony. No one climbed the tower ladder. No human figure appeared on the ridge. Only the wind. But the voice was unmistakable. Not because it sounded like someone he knew. Because it carried the same strange steadiness as before, the same tone of address without panic, without force, as if the mountain itself had learned the shape of his name and was testing whether he would answer differently this time. He closed his eyes. A younger version of himself stood on another ridge holding a rope and choosing upward motion because the summit was close and the weather still looked manageable. A younger version of himself believed judgment meant certainty. The present mountain waited. The hiker below stumbled, dropped to one knee in the snow, and rose again. Elias opened his eyes and knew the decision had already been made long before he admitted it. He reached for the emergency pack hanging by the door. Cold weather shell. Rescue rope. Harness. Medical kit. Ice axe. Hand flares. He moved with the economy of someone who had packed for mountains more times than he had spoken kindly to himself. Every buckle checked. Every strap pulled. No wasted motion. As he cinched the pack, the radio came alive again. Lookout 7, confirm visual status. Elias picked it up. Hikers off the marked trail and drifting East Basin. Rescue ETA too long. A pause. Then, maintain tower until team arrives. Elias looked through the window at the small human figure below, now nearly swallowed by crossing bands of snow. He pressed the transmit button. Negative. I'm descending. The answer came immediately. 7, stand by for instruction. He released the button without replying. Instruction, he thought, was always clearer before consequence entered the room. He stepped onto the balcony, secured the tower hatch behind him, and looked once more down the ridge route he would need to take. The path was narrow, exposed in sections, and already collecting ice where meltwater had refrozen beneath the new snow. A careful descent in decent weather would take 30 minutes. In a developing squall, with rescue gear and the need to return with another person, it would take much longer. Fear came, but not in the shape he expected. Not the fear of dying. The fear of being wrong again. The fear of making another judgment call on a mountain and watching another life pay for it. He gripped the railing harder than he needed to. The wind struck his face. And again, quieter this time, almost inside the sound of air moving around stone, Elias. He understood it then. Not as haunting. Not as accusation. As invitation. Not to heroism. To listening. He started down. The first stretch below the tower was exposed rock glazed with thin wind-driven ice. Elias tested each foothold before committing weight. The mountain did not care that urgency existed. It still required respect one step at a time. That, more than anything, had once been his mistake, not recklessness exactly, but allowing the schedule of desire to outrun the tempo of terrain. Snow thickened around him as he descended. The wind pushed sideways across the ridge in hard bursts that tried to turn his body just enough to make balance expensive. He moved diagonally where he could, keeping low, choosing rock over drift whenever possible. Below him the hiker had disappeared briefly into the white, then reappeared as a wavering shape against darker stone. Halfway down, Elias paused behind an outcrop and raised the binoculars one last time before the weather became too dense for them to matter. The hiker was younger than he had first thought. Maybe 20. No proper winter shell. Just a light outer jacket already dark with wet snow. No helmet. Day pack too small for emergency gear. The kind of setup that speaks not of courage but of the common modern faith that trails remain trails simply because maps say so. The young man turned once in a circle, disoriented. Then he started in exactly the wrong direction. Elias put the binoculars away. He no longer needed more information. He needed timing. And timing, on a mountain, was another word for respect. The storm closed in faster than Elias had predicted. By the time he reached the lower ridge shelf, the wind had thickened the air with snow that moved sideways in hard white streaks. Visibility shrank to little more than a narrow circle of gray around him. The mountain had entered its second voice. Not the silent watchfulness of clear weather. Not the quiet patience of drifting clouds. This voice carried force. Snow hissed against rock. Wind slammed across the ridgeline in unpredictable bursts. Every exposed surface grew slick beneath forming ice. Elias slowed his descent. Not because the urgency had faded. Because urgency on a mountain often leads people exactly where they do not want to go. One mistake here would mean 2 rescues instead of 1. He moved carefully down the final slope toward the basin where the hiker had disappeared. Each step tested. Each foothold confirmed before shifting weight. Years of guiding returned to his body automatically. Muscle memory. Old discipline. Skills he had tried to bury after the accident. The storm thickened again. For a moment he lost the entire landscape. The world narrowed to white motion and the sound of wind passing through stone. Then the shape appeared. The hiker lay partially collapsed against a shallow drift near a cluster of boulders. One arm moved weakly. The rest of his body remained still. Elias crossed the final stretch quickly. The young man looked up when he heard footsteps. Relief flooded his face instantly. "I thought I was done," he gasped. His lips were blue with cold. Snow clung to his hair and jacket. "You're not," Elias said calmly. He knelt and checked the young man's pulse. Fast. But strong. "Can you stand?" I think so." The hiker tried to rise. His legs buckled immediately. Elias caught him before he fell back into the snow. "Easy," Elias said. The young man swallowed hard. "I lost the trail." "That happens. I thought I could cut across the ridge and rejoin lower down." Elias nodded once. He had heard that sentence before. Different voice. Different mountain. Same belief. The belief that terrain would cooperate with intention. "What's your name?" Elias asked. "Ben." "All right, Ben." Elias pulled a rope from his pack and secured a harness around the young man's waist. "Here's what we're going to do," he said. "We climb slowly. You stay attached to me. If you slip, I catch you. If I say stop, you stop." Ben nodded rapidly. "I'm sorry," he said through chattering teeth. Elias paused. Something about the apology struck deeper than expected. The same quiet realization he had heard once before on another ridge. "I thought I knew what I was doing." Elias looked up toward the slope they needed to climb. Snow moved across the rock in shifting waves. Wind tore through the ridge above. "It's not about knowing," Elias said quietly. "It's about listening." Ben frowned slightly. "To what?" Elias tightened the rope. "The mountain." The climb back toward the lookout began slowly. The storm intensified as they gained elevation. Wind struck the ridge from the west in hard uneven gusts that pushed against their balance. Snow gathered along narrow ledges, hiding the exact edges of the rock beneath. Elias led. Testing each foothold. Pulling the rope forward. Waiting for Ben to follow. They moved 10 steps. Then stopped. Then 10 more. The pace felt painfully slow. But mountains rarely reward speed. Halfway up the slope Ben slipped. His boot slid across hidden ice and his body dropped sideways toward the basin. The rope snapped tight instantly. Elias leaned hard into the anchor point of his ice axe and absorbed the full weight of the fall. Ben hung suspended for a moment. Then scrambled back to his feet. "Sorry," he said breathlessly. Elias didn't respond. He simply reset the rope and continued climbing. Above them the ridge narrowed. The same shelf of fractured volcanic rock that had broken beneath Elias 2 years earlier ran across the mountainside like an unfinished path. The memory returned instantly. The same angle. The same exposed stretch. The same wind. Elias paused before stepping onto the shelf. The storm howled across the ridge. For a moment the snow parted just enough for him to see something strange. A figure stood further along the ridge. Tall. Still. Watching. Elias blinked. The storm shifted again. The figure remained. A man. Standing calmly against the wind. No climbing gear. No visible shelter. Just watching. Elias felt a strange recognition. The same quiet presence. The same stillness he had seen once before on another mountain in another story he had heard but never quite believed. Ben tugged lightly on the rope behind him. "You see something?" the young man asked. Elias looked again. The figure had not moved. Snow moved around him as if the storm itself avoided touching his coat. For several seconds Elias simply watched. Then the wind surged again. White snow filled the ridge. And the figure vanished. No footprints. No movement. Just empty rock. Elias turned back toward the climb. "Stay close," he said. They crossed the shelf carefully. Each step deliberate. Each shift of weight measured. Halfway across the rock beneath Elias's boot cracked softly. A thin fracture. The same sound. The same warning he had ignored once before. He froze. Ben's voice trembled behind him. "What is it?" Elias looked down. The shelf remained intact. But a section of the outer edge had loosened slightly beneath the storm's pressure. If they moved too quickly the entire slab could shear away from the ridge. Elias shifted his weight slowly toward the inner wall. "Follow exactly where I step," he said. Ben nodded. They moved together across the shelf. One step. Then another. The wind howled across the ridge. Snow stung their faces. The mountain held its breath. Then they reached solid ground. Ben exhaled sharply. Elias did not relax yet. The final climb remained. But something else caught his attention near his boot. A small stone partially exposed through the drifting snow. He bent and picked it up quickly. A spiral etched across its surface. Simple. Ancient. Weathered by time. The same symbol he had glimpsed years ago carved into rock near another climbing route. He turned the stone in his hand. It felt warm despite the cold wind. For a moment Elias felt the strange sensation that the mountain itself had placed the stone exactly where his foot would land. Not as reward. Not as explanation. Recognition. He slipped the stone into his pocket. Then looked back toward the ridge where the figure had stood. Nothing remained. Only snow. Only wind. Only the mountain watching. "Come on," Elias said. "Let's finish the climb." The final stretch to the lookout tower tested every step Elias and Ben had left. The storm had reached full strength now. Wind tore across the ridge in heavy blasts that forced them to lean sideways just to remain upright. Snow thickened into a swirling wall of white that erased the landscape beyond a few yards. Elias moved carefully, guiding Ben along the narrow path carved between stone outcrops and shallow snowdrifts. Neither man spoke much. The mountain required attention. Words would only waste breath. The tower finally emerged through the snow like a dark shape rising out of the storm. Ben let out a weak laugh when he saw it. I didn't think we were going to make it. Elias pulled the rope tighter and guided him up the final ladder. Inside the lookout the wind still roared outside, but the wooden walls muted its force into a distant growl. Ben collapsed into the chair beside the small stove, shivering uncontrollably as the heat began to return to his body. Elias removed the rope harness and handed him a blanket. You'll warm up, he said. Ben nodded, still catching his breath. Thank you. Elias said nothing. He moved to the radio and contacted the ranger station. Lookout 7. Hiker located. Alive. Awaiting extraction. The response came quickly. Rescue team inbound. Weather window opening in a few hours. Elias acknowledged and set the radio down. The storm began easing shortly after dusk. Wind slowed first. Then the snowfall softened into drifting flakes that glowed faintly in the last light of evening. Ben slept in the chair, exhaustion overtaking him. Elias stepped outside. The ridge lay quiet beneath a pale gray sky. The storm had moved east. Clouds parted slowly above the peaks. He looked toward the rock shelf they had crossed earlier. For several seconds nothing happened. Then the mountain shifted. A deep crack echoed across the ridge. Stone fractured along the shelf where Elias had felt the first warning beneath his boot. The entire outer edge collapsed away from the trail. A cascade of rock and snow tumbled down the mountainside, disappearing into the basin far below. Elias stood still. If they had crossed that section even minutes later, the two of them would have been standing on it when the fracture finally gave way. The rockslide would have carried them straight into the valley. The mountain had not saved them. The storm had not paused to give them time. Everything had simply aligned. The descent. The rescue. The climb. The fracture. Timing. Pressure. Balance. Elias rested his hands against the railing of the tower. For the first time in 2 years he allowed himself to breathe without the weight of accusation pressing against his chest. The accident on the other ridge had not been punishment. It had been consequence moving through a system larger than any single decision. He had carried that moment as guilt for too long. The mountain had never asked him to disappear. It had only asked him to listen. Behind him the tower door creaked softly. Ben stepped onto the balcony, wrapped in a blanket. Storm's clearing, he said quietly. Elias nodded. Ben looked down toward the valley where the rockslide had just finished settling. That could have been bad. Yes, Elias said. Ben glanced at him. Why did you come down after me? Elias took a moment before answering. Because I know what happens when someone doesn't. Ben studied the mountain silently. I thought I understood the trail, he said after a while. Elias reached into his pocket and removed the small spiral stone he had found earlier. The etched lines glowed faintly in the cold light. Mountains don't care what we understand, he said. They care whether we're paying attention. Ben looked at the spiral. What's that? Elias turned the stone slowly in his fingers. I'm still figuring that out. The rescue helicopter arrived the following morning. Clear skies had returned overnight. Sunlight washed across the snow-covered peaks as the aircraft settled briefly near the ridge. The team escorted Ben safely down the mountain. Before climbing aboard, the young man turned back toward Elias. I'll remember what you said, he said. About listening. Elias nodded. That's the important part. The helicopter lifted into the sky and disappeared toward the valley. Silence returned to the ridge. But it no longer felt like exile. It felt like space. Days passed. Elias continued his duties at the lookout. But something had changed. He began answering ranger calls again. At first the conversations remained short. Practical. Weather reports. Trail conditions. Nothing personal. But gradually the words grew easier. By early spring Elias volunteered to assist with mountain safety briefings for new climbing groups entering the Cascades. He spoke quietly. Without drama. He did not hide the accident that had driven him into isolation. Instead he described it clearly. A moment of misjudgment. A ridge that fractured beneath the wrong pressure. A decision that had carried consequences he could never erase. But he also spoke about humility. About listening to wind. About recognizing when mountains whisper warnings that pride wants to ignore. The climbers listened carefully. Not because Elias spoke loudly. Because he spoke with experience. Months later, standing outside the lookout tower at sunset, Elias held the spiral stone in his hand again. The mountain stretched endlessly before him. Peaks glowing gold in the fading light. Wind moving softly across the ridges. For the first time since the accident, he spoke aloud. I was wrong. The valley returned the words in a faint echo. I was wrong. But the echo carried no accusation. Only recognition. The mountain had never demanded silence. It had simply reflected the weight Elias carried. When he withdrew, the mountain felt distant. When he stepped forward. Again, it answered. Not with forgiveness. With alignment. Mountains do not judge. They mirror. They amplify. They remember. Elias slipped the spiral stone back into his pocket and looked once more across the endless ridgelines. Somewhere far below, climbers moved along distant trails. Somewhere beyond the peak storms gathered that would eventually cross these slopes again. The mountain would continue watching. And in forgotten heights where wind carries memory across stone older than time, justice does not shout. It whispers. And every act leaves an echo. You have been listening to Whispers of Reckoning. If this story stayed with you, remember something simple. The mountain always answers. But only to those who learn to listen. Every act leaves an echo.